In the autumn of 1882, a sheriff's deputy named Elias Corbin walked into a shuttered farmhouse on the outskirts of a Pennsylvania hamlet called Prewe's Landing and found two boys, identical, thin as reeds, sitting perfectly still on the edges of two iron bed frames that had been bolted into the floor. They did not look up when he entered. They did not speak when he asked their names. They did not move when he lit a lantern and held it close enough to their faces that he could see the pupils contract. The only sound in the room was the slow, steady scraping of two small fingernails against the iron rails of the bed. And when the deputy finally lowered the lantern and looked down at what those fingernails had been carving, night after night, for what he would later estimate to be more than 3 years, he sat down on the floorboards and, in his own written words, wept until he could not see. What Elias Corbin found scratched into those bed frames was not the work of children. It was not language he recognized. It was not any language recorded in any book the county courthouse could produce. And when the letters were finally traced, copied, and sent to a linguist at a university 200 miles away, that linguist wrote back a single sentence, sealed the copies in a locked drawer, and refused, for the rest of his natural life, to ever speak about the Prewe twins again. Before we go any further into what those markings said and what became of the two boys who carved them, do one small thing for me. In the comments below this video, type the name of the town or county you are watching from right now, and one word, only one word, that describes what you felt in your chest when you first heard the phrase Prewe twins. Just one word, that is all, because there is a reason I am asking you to do that, and by the end of this story, you are going to understand why. Type it now, then come back, because what happens next is worse than what you just heard. To understand how Deputy Elias Corbin came to be standing in that farmhouse on that particular autumn afternoon, you have to understand what Prewe's Landing was in the year 1882 and what it had been in the years before. It was, by the reckoning of the County Land Office, a settlement of perhaps 400 souls, arranged in a loose cluster of clapboard houses along a slow bend in a tributary of the Susquehanna River, in a part of Pennsylvania that even the state surveyors of the time described in their field notebooks as unusually quiet, not quiet in the way that pastoral country is quiet, quiet in a way that made men who had ridden through it on horseback comment, in letters to their wives, that the birds did not seem to sing there in the ordinary way, that the wind through the pines carried no sound with it, that when a wagon wheel struck a stone on the packed dirt road that ran through the town, the sound of the impact did not travel the way it should have travelled, but seemed to fall out of the air within a few yards of the wheel itself, as if something in the atmosphere of the place were pressing the sound down into the ground. These were the accounts of men who were not given to fanciful description. They were surveyors, cattle drovers, itinerant preachers, and one travelling dentist who kept a diary that would eventually pass into the hands of a historical society in Harrisburg, where it can, in principle, still be examined today, if you know the right archivist to ask. The town itself had been founded, or so the county records claimed, by a family named Prewe, who had come down from the northern part of the state sometime in the 1830s and purchased a large tract of land at a price that even by the standards of the time was considered suspiciously low. The head of that family, a man whose given name appears in the deed as Ambrose Pre, was described in a single surviving daguerreotype as tall, gaunt, and clean-shaven, with eyes that the photographer had annotated on the back of the plate as being of an unusually pale grey, so pale that the wet collodion emulsion had rendered them almost white. Ambrose Prewe had built the first mill on the tributary. He had built the first church, a small clapboard structure with a whitewashed steeple that leaned very slightly to the east. He had built the first schoolhouse, and he had built, at the far northern edge of the settlement, a large 2-story farmhouse with a stone foundation, a broad wraparound porch, and, according to the assessment records kept by the county tax office, 12 rooms distributed across 2 floors, with a partial cellar beneath, and a low attic space above that was accessed by a narrow staircase behind a panelled door in the upstairs hallway. Ambrose Prewe died in the winter of 1864 of what the attending physician recorded on the death certificate as an ailment of the lungs. He was survived by a wife whose given name the records do not preserve, and by 3 children, a daughter and 2 sons, all of whom continued to live in the farmhouse at the northern edge of the town for the next 18 years. The daughter married a man from a neighbouring county in 1867 and moved away. One of the sons enlisted in a militia unit during a border skirmish in 1871 and did not return, though whether he died in the fighting or simply chose not to come home was never established. The remaining son, whose name appears in the records as Silas Prewe, stayed on in the farmhouse with his mother, and in the spring of 1876 he married a woman from the same town, a woman named Mercy Haldon, who had been a schoolteacher at the small clapboard schoolhouse that his father had built 40 years earlier. Silas Prewe and Mercy Prewe, according to the birth register maintained by the county midwife, welcomed twin boys into the farmhouse on a night in the middle of April in the year 1877. The midwife's ledger notes the birth in a neat, slightly cramped hand, and records that the boys were, in her professional judgment, unusually small but otherwise healthy, that they cried at the appropriate moments, that they took to their mother's milk without difficulty, and that she, the midwife, had judged it safe to leave the household by dawn the following morning. She named the boys in the ledger by the names their parents had given them, Josiah and Jeremiah, though whether the parents ever used those names in the household would later become a matter of considerable dispute. The midwife's ledger also contains, at the very bottom of that same page, a small notation in a different colour of ink, added apparently at a later date, that reads only, "In a hand that trembles slightly, the words return visit strongly discouraged." There is no explanation offered for that notation. There is no record of the midwife ever returning to the Prewe farmhouse, and there is no record of any other medical professional entering that house at any point during the 6 years that followed. What happened inside the farmhouse during those 6 years is, by necessity, a matter of reconstruction. The townspeople of Prewe's Landing, when questioned later by the deputy and by the reporters who eventually descended on the settlement in the weeks following the discovery, offered accounts that were remarkable in their uniformity. They agreed, all of them, that they had not seen the twins in person after approximately the age of 2. They agreed that Silas Prewe had continued to attend church on Sunday mornings, alone, dressed always in the same dark suit, and that he had ceased attending sometime in the year 1879. They agreed that Mercy Prewe had stopped appearing at the general store and at the town well, and at the small circle of women who gathered on Thursday afternoons to sew and to gossip, and that this cessation had also occurred sometime in the year 1879. And they agreed, all of them, that from that year forward no living soul in the town of Prewe's Landing had, to their knowledge, laid eyes on any member of the Prewe family at any time, for any reason, at any hour of the day or night. The house at the northern edge of the town, they said, had grown quiet. The chimney no longer produced smoke, or produced it only rarely, at strange hours, in thin grey columns that dissipated too quickly. The wraparound porch grew a thin film of moss on its northern side. The whitewashed fence that ran along the front of the property began to lean. The windows, which had once been kept clean and bright and hung with lace curtains that Mercy Prewe had sewn herself, grew dim with dust, and then dark with something that the townspeople could not identify but that they described, in interviews, as a kind of interior blackness, as though the rooms behind the glass had been painted a colour deeper than shadow. And yet no one, in all the months and years that this transformation was taking place, went up the path to the porch to knock on the door. No one called out from the road to inquire whether the family was well. No one wrote to the county sheriff to request a welfare check. And when the deputy, Elias Corbin, was later asked why he thought this had been the case, why an entire town of 400 souls had, for a period of nearly 3 years, simply pretended that the house at the northern edge of the settlement did not exist and that the family inside it had never existed either. He thought for a long moment before he answered. And when he did answer, he said only that a person could feel, when they passed that house on the road, a certain heaviness in the air around it, a pressure. A sense, he said, that the house was not empty, and that whatever was inside it did not wish to be disturbed, and that the townspeople, whatever else they were not fools. What finally brought the deputy to the farmhouse in the autumn of 1882 was not a report from a neighbour. It was not a letter from a concerned relative. It was, according to the incident report that Elias Corbin filed with the county sheriff on the evening of the discovery. A smell that had begun, faintly, sometime in the middle of September of that year, and that had grown week by week, until by the second week of October it had become impossible for the townspeople to ignore any longer. It was, the deputy wrote, a smell that did not resemble any smell he had previously encountered in his 14 years of service. It was not the smell of death, which he knew well. It was not the smell of neglect, which he also knew. It was, he wrote, a smell that seemed to have no source in any material substance he could identify. A smell that seemed to come from the house itself, from the wood and the stone and the very air inside it. A smell, he wrote, that made the horses tethered at the fence pull backward against their reins and roll their eyes and refuse, absolutely refuse, to be led any closer to the property. And so, on the afternoon of October the 17th, in the year 1882, with a handkerchief pressed against his mouth, and a lantern in his hand, and a revolver holstered at his hip, that he would later say, in a private conversation with his own brother, he had wished, in that moment, was a rifle instead. Deputy Elias Corbin pushed open the front gate of the Prewe farmhouse, walked up the mossed and warping boards of the wrap-around porch, put his hand on the tarnished brass knob of the front door, and found, to his surprise, that the door was unlocked. Before we move on to what he found inside that house, stop for a second. What you just heard about the smell that emptied a town of its will is the part that changes everything. But it only makes sense when you see it written out next to Deputy Corbin's original incident report. The horse panic, the interior blackness. It's all in the document linked below. Take 5 seconds right now, grab it, and then come back, because what comes next builds directly on it. The link is in the description. QR code is on your screen. The front hall of the Prewe farmhouse, according to the deputy's written account, was cold, not merely cool, in the way that an unheated house in autumn will be cool. Cold in a way that made his breath visible in the beam of the lantern, in a room whose thermometer, when it was later retrieved from the parlour mantelpiece and examined, registered a temperature of 52 degrees Fahrenheit. That was cold, certainly, for a room that had presumably been closed to the elements for weeks. But it was not cold enough to produce the plume of white vapour that the deputy described issuing from his own mouth with every exhalation. Something else was happening in the air of that hallway, something that a thermometer in 1882 was not designed to measure. The walls of the hall had been papered, at some point in the previous decade, in a pattern of small blue flowers on a cream background. That paper was still on the walls, but it had begun to peel, in long vertical strips, from the ceiling down toward the floor, and beneath the peeling paper the plaster was stained in patches of a brownish yellow that the deputy could not attribute to any water damage he could identify. There was no leak in the ceiling above. There was no cracked pipe in the wall behind. The stains had simply appeared, spreading outward from points that seemed to have no source, and had bled through 3 layers of paper as though something inside the wall itself were pressing them outward. The deputy touched one of the stains with the tip of a gloved finger. The paper was dry. The plaster beneath the paper was dry. And yet the stain was there, deep and old, and the colour of dried tobacco, and when he lifted his finger away he found, he wrote, that a small piece of the paper had adhered to his glove and had turned, in the lantern light, from its original cream colour to a colour he could only describe as grey. He moved forward, down the hall. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots in a rhythm that did not seem to correspond to his own footsteps, but rather seemed to be responding to them as if a lighter tread were following him at a distance of perhaps 3 or 4 paces behind. He turned. There was no one there. He continued forward. The creaking resumed. He stopped again. The creaking stopped, but not immediately, not at the same instant that his own feet stopped moving. It stopped a fraction of a second later. And then, after a pause that he estimated in his report as being of perhaps 2 seconds in duration, there was a single additional creak, sharp and distinct, from somewhere behind him, as if whatever had been following him had taken one final step and then stood still. He did not turn around again. He gripped the lantern more tightly and he moved on. The parlour, when he reached it, was arranged as a parlour in that era and in that region would have been arranged. A horsehair sofa against the north wall. Two upholstered chairs facing a small round table on which sat a chipped porcelain tea service and a folded copy of a newspaper. The newspaper, when he later examined it in the sheriff's office, was dated the 7th of March in the year 1879, a date consistent with the townspeople's accounts of when the family had ceased to appear in public. A mantelpiece over a cold hearth held a clock that had stopped at 4 minutes past 3. There was no way to know, from the position of the hands alone, whether that had been 3 in the afternoon or 3 in the morning. A framed photograph on the mantelpiece showed a family group, 4 figures. The man Silas Prewe standing behind a seated woman who held on her lap 2 small children, both of them turned inward toward each other, their faces pressed together in a way that made it impossible to distinguish which of them was which. The photograph was, the deputy noted, unusually dark, as though it had been exposed in poor light, and the faces of the 2 children were, he wrote, difficult to make out. The dining room, adjoining the parlour through a wide arched doorway, held a long oak table on which had been set 8 places. 8, not 4, 8. Each place had a plate. Each plate had, on it, a fork and a knife arranged in the correct fashion. Each place had a folded napkin. And each plate, the deputy wrote, held a small pile of what appeared to be Tanya nature, and what later analysis at the county laboratory would confirm to be ordinary river gravel. Small stones, none of them larger than a fingernail, arranged on each of the 8 plates in a small conical pile, as though they had been carefully spooned there from a larger container. There was no container in the room. There was no evidence, on the polished surface of the table or on the floor beneath, of any spillage. 8 plates, 8 piles of gravel, 8 folded napkins, and around the room, along the walls, 8 chairs, 4 of which had been pulled slightly back from the table, as though someone had been seated in them and had then risen and departed. He climbed the stairs. The staircase itself was of a dark stained wood, with a carved banister that ended, at the top, in a newel post surmounted by a small wooden ball. Halfway up the staircase, on the landing, the deputy paused, because the lantern in his hand had, without any change in the fuel level or the wick, dimmed to perhaps a quarter of its previous brightness. He shook the lantern. The flame did not respond. He held it up to his face. The flame was still burning, but it was burning in a way that produced very little light, as though the air around it were somehow resisting the passage of that light outward. He continued up the stairs. The lantern remained dim, and when he reached the upper hallway and turned to face the row of closed doors that lined it, he found that his eyes, which had by now adjusted to the low light, could see well enough, but that the shadows in the corners of the ceiling seemed to move, very slightly, in a way that was independent of the flickering of the flame. He watched those shadows for perhaps 30 seconds. He wrote, in his report, that he did not turn his back on them until he had made a mental note of the exact. The first door he opened was to a bedroom on the western side of the hall. It contained a bed made up neatly with quilts and a pillow, a washstand, a chest of drawers, and a small writing desk on which sat an inkwell and a pen and a sheet of paper that had, on it, in a handwriting that he later confirmed to be that of Mercy Prewe, the beginning of a letter. The letter was addressed to a sister who lived in Ohio. The date at the top of the letter was the 16th of March, in the year 1879, 9 days after the date on the folded newspaper in the parlour. The letter began, "Dearest Cordelia, I am writing to you tonight because I believe I must, and if you receive this letter and do not receive another, I ask that you please." The letter ended there, in the middle of a sentence. The pen was lying on the desk beside the paper, and the ink in the inkwell had, in the intervening 3.5 years, evaporated to a dry black residue at the bottom of the well. The deputy took the letter, folded it, and placed it inside his coat. The second door he opened was to a smaller room, apparently a sewing room, containing a treadle sewing machine, a dressmaker's dummy, and, on a small side table, a wicker basket full of unfinished mending. The mending in the basket, when it was later examined, was found to include several items of children's clothing, and among those items were 2 identical white nightshirts, each of them cut for a child of approximately 5 years of age, each of them stitched with a small monogram at the collar. One nightshirt bore the initials J.P. The other bore the initials J.P. as well. Both were the same size. Both were unfinished. Both were laid flat in the basket, one atop the other, in a way that would have made them impossible to distinguish from one another if not for the slight difference in the shade of the thread that had been used for the monograms. The third door he opened was to the room that would become, in the newspaper accounts of the weeks that followed, the room that no one who read about it could forget. It was, by his description, a room of moderate size, perhaps 15 feet by 12, situated at the northeast corner of the upper floor, with 2 windows, one facing north and one facing east, both of which had been covered from the inside by heavy black fabric that had been nailed directly into the window frames with iron nails driven at intervals of perhaps 2 inches. The fabric admitted no light. It admitted, so far as the deputy could tell, no air. And the room, when he opened the door and held up the dimmed lantern, was warmer than the rest of the house, warmer by an amount that he estimated, in his written report, at perhaps 15 degrees, though he had no thermometer with which to confirm this at the time. In the centre of the room, side by side, with perhaps 2 feet of space between them, stood 2 iron bed frames. They were of a common design for the period, 4-poster frames with plain iron rails and simple headboards and footboards of thin vertical bars. The mattresses on the beds were of straw ticking, discoloured with age, and with what the deputy later delicately described as evidence of long habitation. The bedding was minimal, a single thin blanket on each bed, no pillow, and on each of the 2 beds, seated on the edge, with their bare feet flat on the floorboards, and their hands resting palm downward on the iron rails of the frame, sat one of the twins. They were, the deputy wrote, wearing identical white nightshirts, though these were not the nightshirts from the sewing basket downstairs, but older ones, worn thin at the elbows, and stained around the collars in a way that suggested they had not been changed in a very long time. Their hair, which was dark, was long and unkempt, and had grown down past their shoulders. Their skin was pale in a way that the deputy struggled to describe. Not pale in the manner of a sick child, pale in the manner of something that had not seen sunlight in years. Their eyes were open. Their eyes were, he wrote, an unusually pale grey, so pale as to appear almost white in the lantern light, and this detail, when the deputy later remembered it, would remind him of the annotation on the back of the daguerreotype of the boy's grandfather, Ambrose Prewe, and he would find himself unable to sleep for 3 nights afterward. They did not look up when he entered. They did not blink. They did not respond to his voice when he spoke to them, first in a low tone, and then more loudly, asking them if they were unwell, asking them for their names, asking them, finally, whether they could hear him at all. They gave no sign of having heard. And the only sound in the room, the only sound the deputy could perceive above the faint hiss of his own dimmed lantern, was the steady, slow, methodical scraping of 2 small right-hand index fingernails against the iron rails of the 2 bed frames. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause, scrape, in a rhythm so regular that the deputy, after listening to it for perhaps a minute, was moved to check his own pocket watch to see whether the scraping was aligned with the ticking of the watch. It was not. It was slower, perhaps 1 scrape every 3 seconds, in perfect synchronization between the 2 boys, as though they were both listening to the same slow metronome that only they could hear. He lowered the lantern. The iron rails of the beds, at the point where each boy sat, had been worn smooth and bright by the constant motion of the fingernails in a small oval patch, perhaps 4 inches long by 2 inches wide, and below that patch, along the length of the rail, and continuing around onto the footboard, and up onto the headboard, and along the second rail on the other side, running the full length and breadth of both bed frames, were the letters, or the shapes, or the marks. The deputy would use all 3 words at various points in his written accounts, unable, apparently, to settle on which was correct. They were, he wrote, arranged in tight, orderly rows. Every character was of approximately the same size, perhaps 1/4 of an inch tall. Every character was separated from its neighbour by a consistent small gap. The rows ran horizontally along the iron, wrapping around the corners of the frame where the iron turned, continuing without interruption, as though whatever was being written had been written continuously, in a single unbroken text, over a period of what the deputy could only estimate, based on the depth and polish of the marks, at somewhere between 2 and 4 years. He counted on the first bed alone before his hand began to shake so severely that he could no longer hold the lantern steady more than 400 rows, each row containing perhaps 60 to 80 characters. On both beds combined, he later estimated, in a written statement to the county sheriff, that the total number of individual characters etched into the iron was in the vicinity of 120,000. He knelt down beside the bed on the left to look at the characters more closely. The boy seated on that bed did not react to his approach. The boy did not shift his weight. The boy did not look at him. The boy's finger continued to scrape the iron rail, and it was only when the deputy leaned in very close, with the lantern held perhaps 6 inches from the surface of the frame, that he was able to see what the characters actually were. They were not letters of the Latin alphabet. They were not, so far as he could tell, letters of any alphabet he had ever seen printed in any book. They were composed of straight lines and small circles and short curved marks, arranged in combinations that seemed, at first glance, to be almost geometric, almost mathematical, but that on longer inspection began to feel, to the deputy, as though they were something else entirely. He wrote, in his report, that the characters gave him the impression of being letters, of representing sounds, of being the written form of a language that could, in principle, be pronounced aloud. But he wrote also that when he tried, in his own mind, to imagine what those sounds might be, he found that his imagination refused to produce them, that the characters seemed to belong to a language that the human voice was not equipped to speak. He stayed in that room for approximately 40 minutes. He documented, as best he could, the appearance of the boys, the arrangement of the beds, the covering of the windows, the temperature of the air. He attempted, several times, to communicate with the twins, without success. He took, from his coat pocket, a small notebook and a pencil, and he copied, as accurately as he could in the dim light, several rows of the characters from the left bed frame. He then, on a fresh page, copied several rows from the right bed frame, and when he later compared those 2 pages, sitting at his desk in the sheriff's office at 2 in the morning, under the light of a good oil lamp, he found that the 2 sets of characters were identical, not similar, identical, character for character, in the same order, in the same combinations. For as far as he had copied on both sides, the 2 boys had been writing, in perfect unison, the same text, for years. He also documented, though he wrote about this only in a private letter to his brother that would surface many decades later in the estate of that brother's grandson, one further detail about the room. On the floorboards beneath each of the 2 bed frames, in a fine layer of undisturbed dust that had accumulated in the years since anyone had last swept there, he saw, when he lowered the lantern and looked, the faint outlines of what he took to be very small footprints. The footprints were bare. They were arranged in a pattern that suggested a great deal of walking back and forth between the 2 beds, and there were, in his estimate, far more than 2 sets of them. There was row, he wrote, perhaps a dozen distinct sets of footprints in the dust, all of them small, all of them bare, all of them of approximately the same size as the feet of the 2 boys who sat, unmoving, on the edges of the beds above. And when he lifted the lantern back up to look at the boys, and he asked them, very quietly, whether there had been other children in that room with them, one of the boys, for the first time since the deputy had entered, moved. He turned his head, very slowly, so that his pale grey eyes were pointed toward the deputy's face, and he smiled. It was a small smile. It did not reach his eyes, and then, without a word, he turned his head back to face straight ahead, and he resumed his scraping of the iron rail. And the second boy, who had not turned his head and who had not smiled, spoke, for the first and only time in the entire duration of Deputy Corbin's visit to the Prewe farmhouse. He said, in a voice that the deputy described as flat, quiet, and utterly without childish inflection, 6 words. And those 6 words, the deputy wrote, he would remember for the rest of his natural life, and he did remember them, and he transcribed them faithfully, and they were as follows. They did not all fit on the bed. The boys were removed from the farmhouse late that same evening, wrapped in blankets that the deputy had fetched from a neighbour's home, and carried out through the front door and down the mossed boards of the porch to a waiting wagon. They did not resist. They did not speak. They did not appear to notice the change in temperature as they were carried from the warm, sealed room into the cold October air, nor did they react to the sight of the sky, which was, at that hour, a clear and moonlit black studded with the ordinary autumn constellations. The deputy, who watched their faces as they were lifted into the wagon, wrote that neither boy looked upward, neither boy looked at the stars. Neither boy, so far as he could tell, had any interest whatever in the outside world. They were driven, that night, to the home of a country doctor named Whitfield Hensley, who lived approximately 11 miles to the south in a larger town called Millgate, which possessed a small brick building that served as both his surgery and, when necessary, as a temporary lodging for patients who required overnight observation. Dr. Hensley received the boys at his door shortly after midnight. His written account of their arrival, which he composed the following morning, and which survives in the medical archives of the County Historical Society, describes them as being in a state of what he termed profound and abnormal quiescence. Their vital signs, when he examined them, were within the normal range for children of their age. Their reflexes were present, but muted. Their pupils were responsive to light, though the response was slower than he would have expected. They were, in his words, physically unharmed. They had not been beaten. They had not been starved. They had not been subjected to any of the ordinary forms of neglect that a country doctor of the 1880s would have recognized. And yet, he wrote, there was something about them that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up in a manner that he had not felt since his service as a field surgeon during the war, and specifically since the night he had entered a burned farmhouse in Tennessee in the year 1863 and found, in the ruins of what had been a nursery, something that he refused, in his written account, to describe. The boys were placed in adjoining beds in a small room at the rear of Dr. Hensley's surgery. They were fed a thin soup, which they consumed slowly and without any evident enjoyment, but which they consumed nonetheless. They were washed gently by an elderly nurse who had been in the doctor's employ for many years, and who remarked, in a letter to her own daughter that was later collected by the same historical society, that the boys' bodies had appeared to her to be unusually cold to the touch, and that even after a hot bath their skin had remained the colour and temperature of something that had been kept for a long time in a cellar. The boys did not speak. They did not respond to questions. They did not appear to sleep, though they lay quietly in their beds throughout the night, with their eyes open and staring at a fixed point on the ceiling that the nurse, when she followed their gaze, could not identify as being anything other than a small, ordinary discoloration in the whitewashed plaster. At approximately 3 a.m, the nurse, who had been sitting in a chair in the corner of the room to keep watch, heard a sound. It was, she wrote, a faint scraping sound. She rose from her chair and lifted her candle. Both boys were lying perfectly still in their beds, their arms at their sides, their hands folded on their chests, their eyes fixed on the same point on the ceiling. But beneath the sheets, at the point where each boy's right hand rested on his own chest, the fabric was moving. In a small, rhythmic, methodical motion, the nurse pulled back one of the sheets. The boy did not react. His right hand was on his chest, as she had thought, but his right index finger was moving, slowly and deliberately, tracing the same shapes, over and over again, in the empty air above his own breastbone. The nurse pulled back the second sheet. The second boy's finger was doing the same thing. In perfect synchronization with the first, she replaced both sheets. She sat down in her chair. She did not sleep for the remainder of the night. And in the morning, when Dr. Hensley came in to check on the boys, she reported to him what she had seen, and he wrote, in his own account of that morning, that upon receiving her report he immediately dispatched a message by rail to a man he knew at a university in the eastern part of the state, requesting that this man come as soon as he possibly could, and bring with him whatever books he possessed on the subject of ancient and unrecorded scripts. The man Dr. Hensley summoned was named Bertram Voss. He was, according to the surviving university records, a professor of comparative philology, a specialist in the classification of languages by their morphological features, and the author of a series of monographs on the extinct scripts of the ancient Near East. He was, at the time of the summons, 47 years old, and he was regarded by his colleagues as a cautious, meticulous, and somewhat pedantic scholar, given to long silences and to the habit of correcting other men's Latin at social gatherings. He was not a man who was prone to sensational conclusions. He was not a man who was known to write letters that trembled. And when he arrived at Dr. Hensley's surgery 3 days later, having travelled by rail and then by hired carriage from his home in the university town, he was met at the door by the doctor and shown into the back room, where the 2 boys were, at that moment, sitting up in their beds with their eyes open and their fingers moving in the empty air above their bedclothes. Professor Voss stayed in that room for 4 hours. He did not attempt, initially, to speak to the boys. He sat in a chair in the corner, and he watched them. He watched the movements of their fingers. He watched the movements of their eyes. He watched the small, occasional twitches of their jaw muscles, which the doctor had also observed but had been unable to interpret. And after 4 hours, the professor rose from his chair and asked to be shown the copies of the characters that Deputy Corben had transcribed from the bedframes. He was shown Corben's notebook. He opened it. He looked at the 2 pages of transcribed characters. He turned the notebook sideways. He turned it upside down. He held it up to the light of the window. He set it back down on the desk. He was silent for perhaps 2 minutes. Dr. Hensley, who was watching him, wrote later that during those 2 minutes the professor's face passed through a sequence of expressions that the doctor had, in his medical career, associated with patients receiving terminal diagnoses. First, a kind of puzzled attentiveness, then a slow dawning recognition, then something that the doctor could only describe as a controlled and inward-directed fear. The professor closed the notebook. He asked the doctor for a moment alone in the room. The doctor left. When he returned, some 15 minutes later, the professor was standing at the window with his back to the room, and he did not turn when the doctor entered. He asked the doctor, in a voice that was very level and very quiet, whether the deputy had transcribed all of the characters from the bedframes or only a sample. The doctor said that the deputy had only transcribed a sample, perhaps a few dozen rows, out of the hundreds of rows that were etched into the 2 frames. The professor said, still without turning, that he wished to travel to the farmhouse in the morning and to make his own transcription of the complete text. The doctor said that this could be arranged. The professor thanked him. And then, still without turning to face the doctor, the professor asked one further question. He asked whether either of the boys had, at any point since their removal from the house, spoken any words. The doctor said that only one of them had spoken, and that this had occurred at the farmhouse itself, in the presence of the deputy, and that the 6 words the boy had spoken had been transcribed by the deputy in his report. The doctor produced the report and read the 6 words aloud. They did not all fit on the bed. The professor was silent for a long time, and then he said, so quietly that the doctor was not initially certain he had heard correctly, one further sentence. He said, "They are not talking about children." And when the doctor asked him what he meant by that, the professor did not answer, and he did not turn around, and he stood at the window looking out at the small kitchen garden behind the surgery for perhaps another 5 minutes, and then he asked, in a normal tone of voice, if he might be shown to his lodgings for the night. The professor was shown to his lodgings. He was provided with a lamp, a basin of water, and a small stack of clean towels. He was informed that breakfast would be served at 7 o'clock in the morning, in the doctor's own kitchen, and that the carriage would be waiting to convey him to Prewe's landing at 8. He thanked the housekeeper who conveyed this information. He closed the door of the lodging room behind her, and he did not, according to her later testimony, produce any sound whatever from within that room for the remainder of the night, though the housekeeper, who slept in a small room on the floor below, and who had unusually sensitive hearing, and who was accustomed to noting the small sounds of guests moving about in the rooms above her own, did state that at approximately 4 in the morning she had risen from her own bed to fetch a glass of water, and that as she had stood in the darkened kitchen holding the glass to her lips she had heard, coming faintly through the ceiling from the direction of the professor's room, a single low sound, which she described in her account as being like the sound of a grown man weeping into his own hands. The sound had lasted for perhaps 10 seconds. It had then stopped, and it had not, she said, resumed at any point in the remaining hours before dawn. The professor appeared at the breakfast table the following morning at 7 o'clock precisely. He was clean, shaved, and dressed in a fresh shirt that had been laid out for him by the housekeeper on a chair beside the door of his lodging-room. He ate a small breakfast of bread and hot tea. He spoke, during the meal, of ordinary matters. He asked the doctor about the weather. He commented on the quality of the tea. He inquired, with polite interest, after the health of the doctor's own family. He gave, in short, no indication whatever that he had spent any portion of the preceding night in any state other than a natural and untroubled sleep. And when the carriage arrived at 8 o'clock, and the professor rose from the table and put on his coat and picked up his leather satchel and his notebook and his magnifying glass, he was in every visible respect the same cautious, meticulous, and somewhat pedantic scholar who had arrived at the surgery 3 days previously. There was, the doctor later wrote, no sign of what had passed in the room upstairs, and no reference to it, and no acknowledgment, and the doctor did not, out of a delicate respect for the professor's evident wish to conduct himself as though nothing had occurred, raise the matter himself. They rode to Prewe's landing in silence. The professor sat facing forward in the carriage, with his satchel on his lap, and his hands folded on top of it. He did not look out of the windows of the carriage. He did not attempt to engage the doctor or the deputy in conversation. And when the carriage passed the outermost farmhouse of the settlement and turned onto the packed dirt road that ran along the tributary of the Susquehanna, the professor closed his eyes and did not open them again until the carriage had come to a halt in front of the mossed and warping boards of the Prewe farmhouse porch. Professor Voss travelled to the Prewe farmhouse the following morning in the company of Dr. Hensley and Deputy Corbin. He spent the entirety of that day and the next in the northeast room on the upper floor, with a lantern, a magnifying glass, a fresh notebook, and a series of long, unsealed envelopes into which he placed, at intervals throughout the day, small folded pieces of paper on which he had made notations that he did not share with either of his companions. He worked in silence. He did not permit either of them to enter the room while he was working. He took no meals. He took no rest. And when he emerged from the room on the evening of the second day, his face was, according to the deputy's later recollection, the colour of old paper, and his hands, when he set his notebook down on the parlour table, were shaking so badly that he was unable to close the cover of the notebook without the deputy's assistance. The professor did not speak that night. He accepted a glass of brandy from the doctor. He drank it slowly. He accepted a second. He drank it more slowly. He sat in one of the parlour chairs, with the notebook on his lap, and he stared into the cold hearth for perhaps 3 hours. And then, some time after midnight, he asked the doctor and the deputy whether they would be willing to accompany him back to Millgate at first light, and to allow him the use of a private room in which he might spend several days composing a full written analysis of what he had transcribed. They agreed. They left the farmhouse at dawn, and Professor Voss did not, from that morning onward, ever again enter the town of Prewe's Landing. He spent the next 11 days in a small back room of the doctor's surgery. He took his meals brought to the door. He communicated with the doctor and the deputy only in brief notes passed under the door. He requested, at various times, additional lamp oil, additional paper, and, on one occasion, a bottle of laudanum, which the doctor supplied, though he wrote in his own day-book that he did so reluctantly and with concern for the professor's mental state. On the morning of the 12th day, Professor Voss emerged from the room. He was, the doctor wrote, thinner than he had been when he had entered it. His beard had grown in unevenly, his eyes were sunken, and he was carrying, in both hands, a large sealed envelope of heavy brown paper, which he presented to the doctor with the request that it be locked in the doctor's safe and that it be opened by no one, at any time, for any reason, until such time as the professor himself might request its return. The doctor accepted the envelope. He locked it in the safe, and Professor Voss departed that same afternoon on the eastbound train, having said nothing whatever in the course of his 11-day analysis about the contents of the text that he had transcribed. He returned to his university. He resumed his teaching duties, and he did not, at any point in the remaining 22 years of his life, publish a word on the subject of the Prewe transcription, nor did he permit the envelope in Dr. Hensley's safe to be opened, nor did he, in any of the surviving correspondence from that period, make any reference of any kind to the events of that October in Pennsylvania. He died in the winter of 1904 of an infection of the lungs in the guest room of a colleague's house in Massachusetts, and it was only after his death and after the reading of his will that the envelope was finally opened by his literary executor. What was found inside the envelope was not, as many had assumed, a translation of the text on the bedframes. It was not even a complete transcription. It was, rather, a short letter of perhaps 800 words in length, addressed to whoever might, at some future date, come into possession of the document, and it began with the sentence, "If you are reading this, then I am dead, and the responsibility for what I withheld now passes to you." The letter went on to say that the professor had, in the course of his 11-day analysis, succeeded in identifying the script on the bedframes as belonging to a family of scripts that had been used in a small region of what was now Western Anatolia, sometime between the 14th and the 10th centuries before the birth of Christ. He had succeeded in matching individual characters to their probable phonetic values, using a comparative technique that involved cross-referencing similar characters that appeared in surviving inscriptions on stone stelae and on clay tablets, housed in the collections of several European museums. He had succeeded in producing a phonetic transliteration of the entire text on both bedframes, which he estimated to comprise, in its complete form, some 122,000 individual characters, corresponding to approximately 18,000 words in the original language. And he had succeeded, at least in his own judgment, in producing a partial translation of that text into English. But he had not, the letter said, included that translation in the envelope. He had, in fact, destroyed the translation. He had burned it in the fireplace of his own study on the night he had completed it, and he had watched it burn until every last page had been reduced to ash, and he had then taken a poker and stirred the ashes until they were unrecognizable. The reason for this destruction, the letter said, was that the text on the bedframes was not, as the professor had initially assumed, a work of religious literature, or a historical chronicle, or a family record, or any other of the ordinary genres of ancient writing. The text was, he wrote, an instruction manual. It was a set of procedures. It described, in careful and methodical detail, a series of actions that were to be performed at specific times, under specific conditions, with specific materials, for the purpose of achieving a specific outcome. And the outcome, he wrote, was such that he could not, in good conscience, allow the procedures to survive in a form that any future reader might be tempted to attempt. The letter did not describe the outcome. It did not describe the actions. It did not describe the materials. It said only that the procedures were of a kind that had been carried out, according to the internal evidence of the text itself, in a great many houses over a very long period of time, in a great many places across the surface of the earth. That the text was not the work of the pre-twins, but had been transmitted to them in some manner that the professor could not fully explain from an older source. That the twins had been, in the professor's judgment, not the authors of the text, but its scribes. That they had been recording what they had been shown, or told, or made to understand, by something that had been present in that northeast room on the upper floor of the Prewe farmhouse for the entirety of the years during which they had been engaged in the scratching, and that this something, the professor wrote, was not, in his considered opinion, a thing that had been confined to that room, or to that house, or to that town, or to that century. It was, he wrote, a thing that had been present in a great many rooms, in a great many houses, in a great many towns, in a great many centuries, and it was, he had come to believe, in the course of his analysis, still present in a great many rooms even now, and it would continue to be present, in one form or another, for as long as there were rooms in which children could be placed and left, and doors that could be closed, and windows that could be covered, and iron bed frames on which small fingernails could be pressed and dragged, in the slow, methodical rhythm of a metronome that only they could hear. The letter concluded with a request. The professor asked that the envelope and its contents be delivered, after his death, to the county sheriff of the county in which the Prewe farmhouse had been located, along with a recommendation that the farmhouse be burned to its foundations, that the iron bedframes be broken up and scattered across separate and distant locations, that the transcription notebooks in the professor's own possession be destroyed unread, and that no further attempt be made, by any scholar or investigator or curious person of any description, to reconstruct or to translate any portion of the text that had been etched into those frames. The letter was signed Bertram Voss, and it bore, beneath the signature, a single postscript, in a hand that was noticeably less steady than the hand of the letter itself, that read, "They are still writing. Somewhere, they are still writing." There is, in the archives of the County Historical Society in Harrisburg, a small collection of related documents that were compiled over a period of decades by a succession of local historians who took an interest in the pre-case and who attempted, each in their own way, to place it within some larger context. Those documents include a list, assembled by a woman named Corinne Halpert, who served as the Society's librarian from the year 1923 until her retirement in the year 1951, of what she called comparable incidents. She had drawn these incidents over the course of nearly 3 decades of patient correspondence with other county historical societies throughout the eastern part of the country, from newspaper accounts, from coroner's reports, from parish burial records, from the private letters of country doctors and country clergymen, and from a small number of published memoirs by frontier lawmen and travelling preachers of the middle 19th century. The list is not long. It contains, in its final form, 17 entries spread over a period of 140 years, and covering a geographical range that extends from the coastal towns of Maine to the pine barrens of Georgia to the plains of eastern Kansas. Each entry describes a case, or the fragmentary remains of a case, in which a household containing one or more children of approximately the same age had, over a period of several years, gradually withdrawn from all contact with its surrounding community, and had eventually been entered, in most cases by a local law enforcement officer responding to some form of complaint or concern, and had been found, in each case, to contain some variation of the same essential scene. The parents were, in most of the cases, deceased, though the manner of their death was almost never determined with any certainty. The children were, in each of the cases, alive, physically unharmed, and in a state that the entering officer typically described using words like blank, or absent, or turned inward, or simply gone. And in every one of the 17 cases, in the room or rooms where the children had been kept, there were marks, etchings, rows of small orderly characters cut into wood, or into iron, or into stone, or in one case into the plastered surface of a wall, that neither the entering officer nor any subsequent investigator had been able to identify as belonging to any known system of writing. Not all of the cases were as thoroughly documented as the pre-case. In several of them, the marks had been destroyed, whether deliberately or through the ordinary processes of demolition and renovation, before any competent scholar had been given the opportunity to examine them. In others, the marks had been photographed or transcribed, but the transcriptions had been lost, or had been misfiled, or had been reported as lost by the individuals responsible for their care, in circumstances that later historians had found suspicious. In one case, from a small town in Vermont in the year 1846, the transcribed characters had been sent by mail to a professor of ancient languages at a college in Massachusetts, and both the transcription and the professor had, according to the surviving correspondence, vanished within a period of 6 weeks, with no subsequent trace of either. In another, from a rural parish in South Carolina in the year 1871, the entering officer had made his own attempt to copy the characters from the wooden frame of a rocking chair on which 2 small girls had been found sitting motionless, and had, according to the parish priest who had accompanied him, found that his own pencil had refused, quite literally refused, to make the marks on the paper. The lead had broken. He had sharpened it. It had broken again. He had produced a second pencil from his pocket. That pencil had also broken. He had abandoned the attempt. Corinne Halpert, in her own written commentary on the list, was careful not to draw any explicit conclusions. She observed, in a dry and cautious tone, that the cases were separated in time and space to a degree that made any conventional explanation of transmission difficult. She observed that the character sets, in those cases where any description of the characters survived, were similar in general appearance, but were not, so far as could be determined from the fragmentary descriptions, identical. She observed that the children involved were, in almost every case, twins, or in a smaller number of cases, sets of 3 or more siblings born within a few years of one another. And she observed, in a single sentence at the end of her commentary, that in every one of the 17 cases, without a single exception, the household in which the children had been kept had contained, at some point during the years leading up to the discovery, a piece of furniture that had been in the family's possession for at least 2 generations, and that had originally been acquired from a source that no living member of the family had been able to identify. The literary executor did as he was asked. The envelope was delivered to the office of the county sheriff, along with a written explanation of its origin and its purpose. The sheriff at that time was a man who had not been in office in 1882, and who had no personal memory of the events at Prewe's Landing, and who read the letter with what he later described in his own memoir as a mixture of scepticism and reluctant unease. He made inquiries. He located the surviving records of the case in the county archives. He read the deputy's original report. He read Dr. Hensley's medical notes. He read the nurse's letter to her daughter. And he made, as recommended, a visit to the site of the Prewe farmhouse. The farmhouse was no longer standing. It had burned to the ground in the year 1891, some 9 years after the removal of the twins, and some 13 years before the death of Professor Voss. The cause of the fire had never been established. There had been no witnesses. There had been no lightning storm that night. There had been no lantern left burning. The fire had begun, according to the fragmentary accounts of the townspeople who had watched it from a distance, sometime in the middle of the night, in the northeast corner of the upper floor, and it had spread with a speed and an intensity that had made any attempt at intervention pointless. The house had burned for 3 days. The stone foundation was still there when the sheriff visited in the year 1905, filled with weeds and small saplings and the accumulated debris of more than a decade of neglect. The iron bedframes, however, were not in the foundation. They had been removed at some point during or after the fire, and their subsequent whereabouts were, and remain to this day, unknown. The sheriff made note of this. He filed the professor's letter in the archives, along with the deputy's report and the doctor's notes. He did not, so far as any record shows, take any further action on the matter. And the case of the twins, which had briefly enjoyed a small notoriety in the regional newspapers in the autumn of 1882, faded, as such cases do, into the accumulated obscurity of the county archives, where it remained, largely undisturbed, for the better part of a century. What became of the twins themselves is, in some ways, the strangest part of the story. They were, after their initial period of care in Dr. Hensley's surgery, placed in the custody of a maternal aunt in Ohio, the same Cordelia to whom their mother had begun the unfinished letter. That aunt raised them, along with her own 3 children, in a small town on the shore of Lake Erie. They attended school. They learned to read and to write, in English, in a hand that was perfectly ordinary and gave no indication of their previous history. They did not, so far as the aunt's surviving letters record, ever again speak of the farmhouse, or of their parents, or of the northeast room on the upper floor, or of anything that had happened to them prior to their removal at the age of 5. They grew up. They grew tall. They were, by all accounts, quiet, polite, hard-working, and unremarkable young men. One of them, Josiah, apprenticed to a blacksmith in his aunt's town, and eventually took over the smithy when the blacksmith retired. He married a local woman. He fathered 4 children. He lived a long and undistinguished life, and died of natural causes in the year 1947, at the age of 70. His obituary, which appeared in the local paper, described him as a respected member of the community, a churchgoer, a man of few words but of great kindness. There was no mention in the obituary of Prewe's Landing, or of the events of 1882, or of his brother. The other twin, Jeremiah, took a different path. He left his aunt's household at the age of 16. He worked, for a period, on the railroads. He travelled west. He settled, eventually, in a small mining town in the mountains of Colorado, where he took work as a night watchman at a silver mine. He lived alone. He did not marry. He did not, so far as the census records indicate, ever have children. He was known, in the mining town, as a solitary and eccentric figure, a man who kept to himself, who worked the night shift by preference, who slept during the daylight hours in a small cabin at the edge of town, and who was said, by those who lived nearest to him, to spend the hours of his rest engaged in some form of continuous, methodical, almost meditative activity, the exact nature of which was never observed by any of his neighbours, but the sound of which, they said, was audible from the road outside his cabin, on quiet nights, as a slow, steady scraping, in a rhythm that never varied, hour after hour, night after night, for the entirety of the 31 years that he lived in that town. He died in the winter of 1938. His cabin was entered, for the first time in the memory of anyone in the town, by the local sheriff and by the town undertaker, who had come to remove the body. The body was found on the small iron cot that served as Jeremiah Prewe's bed. The undertaker prepared the body for burial. The sheriff conducted a cursory examination of the premises, and when the sheriff, in the course of that examination, lifted the mattress of the iron cot to check for any concealed items beneath it, he found, on the iron rails of the cot frame, running the full length and breadth of the frame, and continuing around onto the footboard and the headboard, tightly packed and orderly rows of small etched characters that were not letters of the Latin alphabet, characters composed of straight lines and small circles and short, curved marks, arranged in combinations that seemed almost geometric, almost mathematical, but that on longer inspection began to feel like something else entirely. The sheriff did not know what he was looking at. He made a brief note of the markings in his report. He described them as scratches, probably decorative in nature. He noted that they appeared to be old, and to have been made by hand, and that they covered the entire surface of the bed frame. He filed the report. The cot was sold at auction, along with the rest of Jeremiah Prewe's few possessions. The buyer was a man from Denver, whose name the auction records do not preserve, and the cot passed, from that man, into the collection of a private dealer in antique furniture, from whom it was purchased in the year 1952 by an unknown party who paid in cash and who did not provide a shipping address, but who arranged for the cot to be collected in person by a hired driver, and who has never, so far as any subsequent researcher has been able to determine, been identified. The cot has not been seen since. There is a further detail concerning the cot from the miner's cabin that is worth mentioning here, before we move on to what may be the most difficult part of this account. When the local sheriff and the town undertaker entered Jeremiah Prewe's cabin on the morning of his death in the winter of 1938, they were accompanied, at the request of the undertaker, by a young man from the town who had been engaged to help carry the body down to the wagon. That young man, whose name was recorded in the town's newspaper obituary of Jeremiah Prewe as being Halden Rooker, was, at the time, 16 years of age. He was the son of the town's postmaster. He was known in the town as a quiet and observant boy, and he had, in the years that followed, become the town's postmaster in his own right, and had eventually served in that capacity for the better part of 4 decades, until his own retirement in the year 1979. In the year 1982, 100 years to the month after the events at Prewe's Landing, a woman from Denver who was researching the history of the mining town for a book she was writing on the labor movements of the Western silver camps traveled to the town and, in the course of her research, obtained an interview with the elderly Halden Rooker, who was then in his 80th year and living in a small assisted care facility on the outskirts of Denver. The interview lasted for approximately 2 hours. It concerned, for most of that duration, matters of an ordinary historical nature. But near the end of the interview, when the woman was closing her notebook and preparing to leave, Halden Rooker, who had been sitting quietly with his hands folded in his lap, said something that she had not expected. He said that he had, at the age of 16, entered the cabin of Jeremiah Prewe on the morning of the old watchman's death. He said that he had helped the undertaker to prepare the body for removal. He said that he had, while doing so, glanced at the iron cot on which the body had been lying, and had seen the marks etched into the frame, and had understood immediately, without knowing how he understood, that the marks were writing. He said that he had, in the years that followed, occasionally dreamed about those marks. He said that in his dreams the marks had been arranged in a slightly different order than he remembered them being arranged on the actual cot, and that in his dreams he had been able, without any effort of translation, to read them. He said that in his dreams the marks had been an instruction to him personally. He said that in his dreams the instruction had been simple and gentle and reasonable, and that in his dreams he had frequently found himself agreeing with it, and had woken from those dreams in a state of considerable distress, because he had not, in his waking life, agreed with it at all, and had not wished to agree with it, and had been afraid of what it might mean that some part of him, in the small, quiet part of himself that responded to certain patterns without the intervention of the conscious mind, he said that he had never told anyone about the dreams. He said that he was telling the woman from Denver about them now, at the age of 80, because he had recently begun to have the dreams again after a gap of many years, and because he had begun to feel, in his waking hours, a certain slow, patient pressure in the back of his own mind, as though something were preparing him for a decision that he did not wish to make, and because he wished, before that decision was placed before him, to have said the words out loud to another human being, so that the words would exist somewhere in a form that was not confined to his own head. The woman from Denver wrote up the interview. She included it in an edited form in the appendix of her book, which was published in the year 1984 by a small university press, and which had, so far as any subsequent bibliographer has been able to determine, a print run of approximately 800 copies. Halden Rooker died in his sleep in the spring of 1983, some 4 months after the interview and some months before the book's publication. The manner of his death was recorded on the death certificate as natural causes. The staff of the assisted care facility, who had liked him and who had cared for him for the previous 7 years, reported that on the morning his body was found, the drawer of the small night table beside his bed had been open, and that inside the drawer, on top of the folded handkerchiefs and the pocket watch and the small worn Bible that had been the contents of that drawer for as long as any of the staff could remember, there had been placed a single sheet of the facility's stationery on which the deceased had written, in what appeared to be the last hours of his life, in a hand that was slightly tremulous but wholly legible, 6 words. The words were as follows. They did not all fit on the bed. The transcriptions in Professor Voss's personal papers, which his executor was supposed to have destroyed, but which, it later emerged, the executor had merely deposited in a locked box in the university's rare books library on the assumption that the professor's request had been the product of a disordered final illness, were rediscovered in the year 1978 by a young graduate student who was cataloguing the collection. That graduate student, whose name has been withheld from all subsequent published accounts at his own request, read the transcriptions. He was not a specialist in ancient scripts. He could not read them. He photographed them. He sent the photographs to 3 separate colleagues at 3 separate universities, all of whom were specialists in the general area of ancient Near Eastern languages, and all of whom, upon receiving the photographs, wrote back to him within the space of a few days, and all of whom, in the years that followed, either changed their fields of study or retired abruptly from academic life, or, in one case, took their own life, in a manner that the coroner's report described as inexplicable, given the individual's previous mental history and apparent life satisfaction. The graduate student destroyed the photographs. He destroyed his own notes. He left the university. He is believed to still be alive, in his early 70s now, living quietly somewhere in the northern part of Michigan, and he has, according to those who have attempted to contact him, refused every request for an interview, every invitation to a scholarly conference, and every offer of any kind of publication. And he has said, to the small number of researchers who have made the trip to his home and knocked on his door, only that he does not wish to speak of the matter, and that he hopes, sincerely, that no one else ever will. The transcriptions themselves remain, so far as anyone knows, in the locked box in the rare books library. The library has, since the events of 1978, adopted a policy under which the box may not be requested by any patron for any purpose, and under which the existence of the box is not disclosed in any published finding aid or catalogue. The box is checked once a year by a member of the library staff who is required to confirm that the seal on the box has not been broken and to file a brief written report to that effect with the office of the university archivist. And every year, without exception, since 1978, that report has been filed on time, and the seal has been confirmed to be unbroken, and the box has been returned to its shelf, and the door of the storage vault has been closed and locked and left. There is a temptation, when one comes to the end of a story like this one, to reach for a tidy explanation, to conclude that the Prewe twins were the victims of a rare and undiagnosed neurological disorder that produced in both of them simultaneously an identical compulsive behaviour, to conclude that Deputy Corbin and Dr. Hensley and the nurse whose name we do not know and Professor Voss and the country sheriff who visited the burned foundation in 1905 and the graduate student who found the transcriptions in 1978 were all, in one way or another, mistaken, that the characters on the bedframes were the meaningless scratchings of two disturbed children, that the correspondences between the two sets of markings were an artifact of coincidence or of shared imitation, or of a psychological bond so intense that it produced a spurious appearance of language where no language existed. That Professor Voss's letter was the product of a mind that had, in the course of 11 days of solitary labour in a small back room, cracked under the strain of what he had convinced himself he was seeing, that the entire chain of events, from the smell that emptied a town of its will in the autumn of 1882, to the sealed box in the rare books library that no patron has been permitted to see for nearly 50 years, is a folk story that has been assembled over the intervening decades from a small number of genuine but unremarkable historical incidents. That temptation is, in the end, a comforting one, and I would encourage you, if you feel it, to indulge it. But I would ask you, before you close this video and return to whatever you were doing before you began watching it, to consider one small thing. The word that you typed in the comments near the beginning of this story, when I asked you what you felt in your chest when you first heard the phrase Prewe twins. Take a moment. Look at that word. Look at your own comment. Look at the words that other people from other towns, from other counties, from other parts of the world entirely, have typed beneath their own names. Look at how many of those words are, in some way, the same word, or words that mean the same thing, or words that describe the same feeling, a feeling that arrived in each of you at very nearly the same moment, a feeling that you did not choose, a feeling that was not, in any meaningful sense, produced by anything I had said, because at the moment you felt it, I had not yet told you anything at all. You felt it because you recognized something. You did not know, in that moment, what you were recognizing. You could not have named it if you had tried. You had never heard of the Prewe twins. You had never heard of Prewe's Landing. You had never seen the characters on the iron bedframes. And yet something in you, in the small quiet part of you that responds to certain patterns without the intervention of the conscious mind, responded to a name, to a phrase, to an arrangement of syllables that, so far as your ordinary experience was concerned, meant nothing at all. Professor Voss, in the final paragraphs of the letter that his executor was supposed to have delivered and to have kept secret and to have burned, wrote one further sentence that I have not, until now, shared with you. He wrote that the text on the bedframes was, in its complete form, not merely an instruction manual for a procedure. It was also, in some sense that he could not fully articulate, a signal, a frequency, a slow, patient, methodical broadcast, transmitted through the iron of the bedframes into the wooden floor of the northeast room, and from that floor into the stone foundation of the house, and from that foundation into the earth beneath the house, and from that earth outward, in a way that he could not measure and could not detect, but that he was, by the end of his 11 days, wholly and quietly convinced was happening. A signal that was being received, he wrote, by an unknown but perhaps very large number of other listeners, in other rooms, in other houses, in other towns, listeners who did not know that they were listening, listeners who could not have named what they were hearing, listeners who would, in the ordinary course of their days, feel occasional small, unaccountable stirrings in the small, quiet parts of themselves, and would attribute those stirrings to indigestion, or to fatigue, or to the weather, or to nothing at all. Look at your comment. Look at how many others are the same. The iron bed frames from Prewe's Landing have not been seen since the fire of 1891. The cot from the miner's cabin in Colorado has not been seen since 1952. The transcriptions in the locked box in the Rare Books Library have not been read since 1978, and by policy will not be read again. The house is gone, the twins are gone, the professor is gone, the deputy is gone, the doctor is gone, the nurse is gone, the graduate student is old and unwilling to speak, and the specific characters that were etched, night after night, over a period of years, into the iron rails of 2 bed frames in a small northeast room on the upper floor of a farmhouse in a Pennsylvania town of 400 souls, no longer exist in any form that any living person is permitted to see. And yet you felt it, at the sound of the name, at the arrangement of the syllables. Something in you responded, at the very beginning of this story, before you had been given any information at all. Ask yourself, quietly, when you're alone tonight, and when the lights are off, and when the house is still, whether there is any small corner of any room in the place where you sleep that you have, without ever quite knowing why, avoided for as long as you can remember. Whether there is any piece of furniture in that room that was there when you arrived, and that has been there ever since, and that you have never quite been able to bring yourself to move. Whether there is any surface, of iron, or of wood, or of stone, on which, if you looked at it very closely, in a low light with a magnifying glass, you might see marks that you had not previously noticed. Small marks, orderly marks, arranged in tight, patient rows. You will probably find nothing. But if you do find something, do not try to read it. And do not, under any circumstances, run your own fingernail along the same rail, in the same rhythm, and see what happens. Sleep well.